been a long quarter. Is it? Yeah, you're in week 8, right? Is it week 9 already? Week 9. Yep, and then you have finals. Yes, I agree, Nikita. It did feel like a long quarter. Oh, you're starting week 10. Gosh, I missed a week of my life. That's okay. All right, so let's get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Joanne. I'm joined here today with Doug. Both of us are HPA staff, and we are going to talk all about experiences today. And then we'll have our Mcat instructor come in halfway through and talk a little bit about the Mcat. So today we're going to do all the sort of nuts and bolts of experiences, and we're going to look at some experience writing, and we're going to talk about conceptually how experiences fit into the bigger picture of your whole med school application. You spend 4 years or 5 years, sometimes 6 years, building up your experiences. That's a huge part of your medical school application process. And for a lot of you, that's probably one of the most stressful parts. While you enjoy what you're doing, a lot of people feel like, I hear this a lot, I don't have enough, or I don't have as, you hear things from other people, you hear people in your classes, your friends, your roommates talking about what they're doing. And I think a lot of people have a lot of anxiety around experiences because they just never feel like they have enough. And so I want to talk a little bit today about conceptually what is enough and what matters. And so if some of you are in the process of applying this coming spring of 21, honestly, you should be pretty done with experiences. So the parts where we'll talk about the actual writing and developing your application, that'll be a lot more relevant to you. And if we have any younger students here, first or second or third years, who still have a little bit of time before they're going to apply, then I want you to keep in mind that as you still continue to build on your experiences, you probably want to just think about this conceptually, what really matters when it comes to gaining experiences, because it's definitely not a formula or a checklist or some of the things that I think, or that I hear from students in terms of what they think it should be. All right, so we will jump right in. Again, I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth between like logistical stuff and conceptual stuff, but just so you're aware, the two application systems are a little bit different when it comes to how experiences are displayed. So this is important for you to know, especially if you're early in your career. Amcas only has 15 experience slots. If you have never done this, I would encourage you to open up a Word doc or a Google Doc and number 1 through 15, and starting from high school, the summer after you graduated high school, start listing every single thing that you've done. Most people come to me and they say, I don't think I have enough experience. And then when I make them do this activity, I actually usually do it for people because it forces them to think. So I'll say, did you ever have a job? Have you ever had any job? Working at Subway or Kohl's or in the coffee shop, it doesn't matter, any job. Every single job you've had counts. Have you ever been in a club? Have you ever done an intramural sport? Have you ever done a cultural event? Have you ever attended a conference? When you start breaking down all of those things, all of that counts within the 15. And you're going to realize really quickly that you probably have 15 or even more at some point. Some people are very, very close. They have like 10. It's not that you have to have 15 experiences. It's just that's the cap. So a lot of people, because they have this misconception of what med schools want, they actually do far more than 15 over the course of 4 years or 5 years. And so it's really hard to bring it down to 15. So they're finding themselves like grouping activities together. Yeah, attending conferences count as an experience. So you could, let's say you attended 5 conferences over your college years. You could put one event called, or one experience called conferences attended, and just list them out as bullets. But if you didn't have enough experiences, you could literally count every single conference attended as its own experience. People do that in all different ways. But my point is you only have 15. So when you start breaking down what you've actually done, you'll realize you fill 15 very, very easily. And so with those 15 experiences, and ACOMAS, so DO app is unlimited, so you could have 25 or 30 experiences. I really encourage you not to have 25 or 30 experiences, but you could if you wanted to. For Amcas, you have 700 characters for each experience. So that's about, I'm going to show you what that looks like later, but that's a big paragraph. It's like a chunky paragraph, right? Like literally about that long in a Word doc. So 700 characters times 15. How many characters is that? You guys are good at math. Do that real quick. That's a lot of characters, right? Does anybody remember how many characters are in a personal statement? $5,300 for your personal statement. So how many characters do you have just for your experiences? Where are my math people? You have phones with calculators. It's funny, I should know this one. Well, anyway, you have a whole lot of characters. In addition to your 700 characters for each experience, you have 3 meaningful experiences. So you have to pick 3 of your experiences and you have to indicate that they're meaningful. It's just, that's the phrase they use. And with those 10,000 characters for your experiences section, with your 3 meaningful, you have an additional 1325 characters for 3 of them. So in the experiences section, you'll have one box that will be 700 characters of what did I do? And you'll have a second box, separate box. So it's not one long running piece of writing, a separate box that is an additional 1325 characters saying, how did it change you? So there you go. Thank you, Douglas. Thanks, Doug. 14,000 characters in total for your experiences section. Now, most people start writing their personal statement, that's with spaces, in January. And a lot of people will start putting off their experiences section because it doesn't feel quite as important to them in terms of writing until later. But when we look at how many characters are devoted to your experiences in your application, you can see that it's a significant part of your application in terms of just words or presence in the pages, right? Your total app's about 30 pages long PDF'd. This is a big chunk of it. So what does this also tell us? Jing, you have a question? Let me see here. Oh, I missed that. I'm sorry. I heard you can't include experiences if you took them for credit. So if, like, let's say, for example, you had done a student-run clinic and there was a clinic seminar attached to that. That seminar is actually used for insurance purposes, so it should be fine. If it was research, even though that's a technical law, nobody follows it. Everybody puts their research into their application. Can you give me an example of another for-credit experience that you're not sure about? Clinic and research. Yeah, peer tutoring, same thing, Lucy. You would want to definitely report your peer tutoring. Yep, all of that is totally fine. And Madison, in terms of study abroad, I would probably not focus on the academic aspect of your study abroad, but more of the cultural learning or the traveling that you did. But everybody talks about being in LA, everybody talks about their research, everyone talks about clinic. It doesn't matter, it's never held anybody back, so you don't have to worry about that. We even have people who talk about their honors research, even though it was part of the honors program. And same thing, like if you're a global disease bio major, you have to do research for your major, but you still talk about it. And what else? You know, things like that. If you're part of an honors program and it's, or honors society, I don't think you get credit for that. 198 internship class. Oh, what? Yeah. So again, like you wouldn't emphasize the credit aspect of that in your writing, obviously, but you would talk about what you took away from it. So yes, Laura, it shouldn't be a problem. Most med schools, I would argue, just are not even cognizant of this issue. If you made it apparent that that's what was happening, then they might be like, oh yeah, no, that's true, you're not supposed to do that. But if you don't bring it up, they're probably not going to pay attention to that. I have a question. If you take a gap year, should you write the most recent or most significant for 15 experiences? You choose however you want to shape those 15, but if you're doing something in your gap year and you don't put it in your application, I think the schools would be a little confused about what you're doing in your gap year. So once you graduate from college, most med schools are going to expect that you're working 40 hours a week. If you're not working 40 hours a week, you should be studying for the Mcat or working part-time or going part-time school, part-time work. But anyway, you should spend 40 hours a week doing something. It's not okay to just like chill, relax, spend time with family when you're not in school. You can do that for a little while. Everybody should get a week or two vacation, but you can't devote like 6 months to spending time with your family. You really need to be doing something. And if you can't get a job, then I would say find some kind of community service activity to keep you busy. All right, so these are some of the very, very many experiences that people do at UC Davis. There's no limit to the type of experience you can have, and there's no best experience. There's no experience that med schools like more than others. Med schools don't calculate hours in terms of clinical hours. There isn't a school, as far as I know, that has like a minimum. I'm sure there are some out of the 146 med schools out there. There's some school that has a minimum shadowing hours, but I literally don't know what one it is because it's not an issue. And none of our students have ever come across that problem. How far back in scholastic career? You should start the summer after you graduated high school. So unless you met the president or were patented in high school, you probably wouldn't list a high school experience. I think that when it comes to listing these experiences, for example, I'm going to use a student-run clinic because that's a pretty common or popular experience. You have 15 spots. Sometimes you start an experience and you start out with one job title. So you might start out as an intake, someone who checks into patients. I don't know what that would be called, a regular intern. And then after a year, you get moved up to a health advocate or patient advocate. And then in your third year at the clinic, you would become a chair or a board member. So you have 3 different job titles. Now, if you put all 3 years in your one experience, it will look like you did the experience for 3 years in your application. But you will have only 700 characters in the 1325 if it's meaningful to talk about all 3 of those jobs. So that could be a little challenging, right? For some people, that's a lot of responsibility. So what some people opt to do is they choose to break them out into 3 different experiences and focus on those 3 different responsibilities. And let's say you wouldn't want to use, I would say, 2 of the 3 for meaningful, but one of those would probably be meaningful, I'm guessing, if you did it for 3 years. Now, what you might want to consider doing is for each of those experiences, you have to group them into some kind of category. So these are the categories that are in Amcas. And we know that there are some med schools that do screen applications based on community service. I am not aware of any med school that screens applications on research or clinical experience, but they do screen on community service. So if you don't have anything that is straight up community service, what you would want to do is use some of your experience hours for your student-run clinic towards community service. I know you might think it's better to have bajillions of hours of clinical, but it actually isn't. Most med schools don't really think like a patient care advocate is clinical experience, because clinical experience is touching patients. It's like doing the intake, it's taking blood pressure, but talking to people, educating people, that's more like public health. And so that would be still a very important thing you did, but I don't think it would count as clinical experience if we're being technical about a definition of clinical experience. But there's nothing wrong with counting it as community service, because most med schools would screen for community service. Nope, Lucy, I don't know what number it would be, but you want to put as much as you can. And I guess my question is, if you should have, I don't know how to answer your question. I don't know how to tell you which school. I've only heard that there are some that do it. I know Rosalind, Franklin, and Rush do it. But out of the 145, I can't tell you which ones do it. Let me see.
So we got a few questions here.
Yeah.
Can you include a job, or sorry, if you shadowed doctor in high school, could you put that?
I probably wouldn't, unless it was something you did all the way into college. If you continued shadowing the same doctor in college, then you can backdate it to the date you started in high school.
So this one's somewhat related to what you just said. Can you include a job you had during high school and into that summer after high school?
If you want to, yes. If you didn't do if you don't have 15 other things from your 4 years in college, then you can definitely do that. Or if it was a really important, significant job.
Then, so would volunteer work go in experiences?
Yes, all of your volunteer work would go in experiences.
And then let's see. If we were a scribe, that would go in experiences, correct? And yes.
Absolutely, that would be a paid experience.
And then how would clinical experience change now with COVID when we can't physically touch patients and are doing telehealth?
Well, since most med schools never required clinical experience to begin with, it doesn't make any difference. Clinical experience is just something that people do to show that this is what they really like to do. And med schools, since they're doctors, also do not want you touching patients. So it's not that they're going to have some requirement that you should be out there doing these things that they're encouraging you not to do, right? Like as physicians, they're encouraging you to stay home. So do you see what I'm saying? Like they're not going to be holding that against you if you haven't found a quote clinical experience. I think you do as much as you can. So whatever you can do that's safe for you to do right now, then you do that. If it's tutoring children online, or if it's being a personal care attendant for a sick or elderly person in your neighborhood, maybe it's being a crisis hotline worker from your home, or if you can do telehealth, that's amazing. If you can be a scribe over the phone, if you can actually get a scribing job where you can go into the hospital, that's amazing. I mean, you have to make a decision for yourself in terms of how much risk you want to put yourself at this point. I know if you're still on campus, we have the EVE 198 course where you can be a COVID tester. So you can register for that 2-unit class and then go test for COVID. And there's plenty of space in that class if you want to do that. But there are just not a lot of options. There are not a lot of things that you can do right now. And that's okay. They understand that, but you're still going to have your 15 slots. So let's say you get to the end of your college career and you only have 5 things on your list. You've brainstormed, you have literally only done 5 things in 4 years. Well, one might argue that you don't have, it's not that you haven't checked off a box or you haven't satisfied any kind of med school requirement. It's that you simply haven't had enough life experience. Like conceptually, why would they want you to have experiences? Is it just because if you do a certain number of things, like if you have 10 experiences or 15 experiences versus 10 experiences, you are magically going to be a better doctor? Is that what it like actually is about? And the same thing is like, how is being a scribe better than being an EMT or working for MRAP or any of the dozens of other things you could do? It's not that any of these, it's not like they care about any of them. It's not like any of them matter more than another to the med schools. At the end of the day, none of this, like they've seen all of this. Like there's nothing you're going to do that's going to impress a medical school. It's not about that. They're not going to be like, oh my God, look at this person. They really did all these really, no, they're going to be like, who is this person? What did they choose to do? How does what they chose to do tell us what they care about? And so I'm kind of going, let me go through some of these questions I have. You can use the same category twice, absolutely. When you have meetings in a club that plan for volunteer programs, you can break, like I understand what you're saying, if you're in a club and you do community service, you can double dip, but I probably wouldn't just build your whole experiences section on double dipping. I probably would just limit that to a couple. So if you're in the club and the club is based on volunteer work, you probably only want to focus on like the large projects and not try to count every single volunteer experience you did for the club. You can't put those same hours in the club then, right? Like if you're counting the volunteer activities you did for the volunteer section, you can't turn around and add those hours into the club too. So no double dipping in the sense of duplicating hours, but you can break experiences up and put them in 2 different categories. You just want to have different titles. Would clinical research coordinator be clinical experience? To me, it sounds like research, but I guess you know the job better than I do. Clinical experience is where you are helping patients. That's what clinical experience is. So if you are in a position where you are delivering healthcare and helping patients, then that's clinical experience. Do you recommend using the same category more than once or using all the categories? I really don't think med schools care at all about that. I don't think anyone is cross-checking which categories you used. That is a large amount of mental energy that I promise you they're not using in this process. What is a good number of experiences? Should we have 15? You should have I would say between 10 and 15. I think, again, it's not because if you don't have 10, they're going to automatically rule you out. I just think that when you do experiences, well, why don't you all tell me, what is the purpose of you doing experiences? Why even have this section? What are they looking for? So it definitely expands your worldview. Do they like when people do everything with people who are similar to themselves? Right. So they like to see that you have worked with people different from yourself. They like to see that you've grown in some way, that your perspective has changed. They want to see that you have some competencies. Do you remember what those 15 competencies were? We talked about that, I think, last time or the week before. So they want to be able to figure out which of those competencies you have, of the 15 core competencies, and they can start to figure some of that out through the things that you did. So who can tell me what are one of the 15 core competencies, and what's one experience you've had where you've demonstrated that competency? All right, I'll pick a competency. Oral communication, public speaking. Who has done an experience where you've had to talk in front of people? What was the experience? Exactly. Okay, so when you're writing, let's say Nikita has already, in her experiences section, has already deliberately chosen which competencies she's going to highlight through, all of her experiences, but she realizes, I haven't really talked about my oral communication in any of my experiences. Now, with her student-run clinic, there's probably a dozen things she could talk about. There are so many different experiences or, things she's done. She gets to pick and choose, though, what she talks about in those 700 characters. So if you're being strategic about this and deliberate, what you would want to do is think about, what do I want them to understand about me through these experiences? So you can say, yeah, sure, I did intake, I did this, I did that. All of these things are, a dime a dozen, everybody's done them, and they're in half of the other experiences you've done too. But if you've had a situation where you got to present to a class, or you got to talk to a large group of patients, or you got to run a seminar for your peers, now you're highlighting communication. And that's something maybe you hadn't thought of to do in any of the other experiences. So now they know all the other stuff from all the other experiences, but in this one, now they have that extra competency because you decided, you were deliberate about focusing on a different competency in that experience writing. That's really strategic. So if you're thinking every single time, I've got to show them the most clinical thing I've done, I've got to say 15 times that I did intake and I did blood pressure and I did this and that, because it makes me seem more like a doctor. And that's what you're saying over and over and over. After they've read it twice, they're like, okay, we get it. You know how to do intake. That's interesting, right? We're going to teach you how to do it when you get to med school anyway. But what they don't know is, does Nikita know how to stand in front of a group and can talk with confidence, right? And that's just as important as being able to do someone's blood pressure, because they don't have time to teach you how to do public speaking in med school. That's not what they have built into the curriculum, right? They don't have time to teach you cultural humility in med school. They don't have time to teach you how to grow and learn and take feedback and all of the other competencies that are so important to them. That's what they want to know from your experiences, is that you have mastered those competencies. The very technical things that you do in your all your activities, again, like, that's nice, but that's not what's super impressive to them. They've already told us exactly what they're measuring in you, and that's with those 15 core competencies. So conceptually, what we want to do is decide which experiences we include on our list that highlight as many competencies as we can. It's not about having 15 experiences, it's about having competency to be a good doctor. So if you only have 5 experiences, one might argue that you don't have enough life experience to prove to them that you're qualified to do this. Does that make sense to everybody? It's not about checking off boxes. It's about showing them who you are and what you can bring to the table. And if you can move past that and realize that you have one answer or one question to answer. What is the value that I bring to you, med school? Like, what is the value I bring to the career of medicine? And you have to brainstorm all the things that you bring. And remember, we're not talking about I'm driven and I have empathy and all that kind of stuff. We're talking about actual value, things you can do for the field. And so when you brainstorm those things, then you pick the experiences that showcase those things. All right, I think I've beat that into the ground, maybe.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Yeah.
A lot of that idea, the mentality of the checklist that Joanne brought up is echoed so much online. You just have to be careful on what resources you're using and where you're finding these things. Because I just looked up on Google just quick med school experiences and I found checklist after checklist after checklist. And so just be mindful of that. A lot of that information out there isn't necessarily represented in a good way, just because it's the internet and things tend to get represented in funky ways. I did want to bring up a question that was asked a little bit ago. For the awards, recognitions, honors, if we graduated high school as a member of something like National Honor Society or something like California Scholarship Federation, or if you graduated at the top of the class, would we want to include that?
Yeah, you would put that under honors. There's a honors awards achievement section. So if you got any type of scholarship or award, you would definitely list that in your application. I probably wouldn't put all of your dean's lists in separate experiences. I would just put one section and put all of your honors, because if you have that many honors, my guess is you have a lot of experiences too. So you probably wouldn't want to use up all your sections for that. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can put everything that you see here, anything and everything goes in your application. Even if you just did like 1/4 of intramural sports, what's the value of telling them that you did intramural sports? What do they understand about you by doing that? Yep, definitely teamwork. What else? Yeah, Lillian, you know how to relax. Like, you actually have something you enjoy doing besides work. That's amazing. Why would they care about that? Yep, absolutely. You can put a medical mission in there. Someone asked, can we do a week of medical mission? The only thing that's really important when you talk about medical missions is that you don't talk about how important you were in that space. So you don't talk about yourself being like a superhero, like we went into this third world country and look how much difference we made to these people's lives. Don't do that. Just talk about how those people impacted you and leave it at that. There's a big chance you did not change that community, you did not have a big impact on that country, and med schools are really critical of people who have like a superhero syndrome. Let me go back up. I think I might have missed some. Yeah. Yes, sports cope with stress, well-balanced person. You need to have a life. Absolutely. So I don't know if you're all aware of this, but there is a huge problem in medicine and actually most of the health professions where doctors, vets, a lot of people have substance abuse problems. There's a high degree of depression and even a higher suicide rate amongst health professionals compared to the rest of society. And so being able to have stress outlets, having a healthy way to relax, they're going to ask you a lot of questions in your application, like secondaries and interviews, about how you have fun. And those kind of fun questions, those are intentional. They really want to understand that you do have fun, that you can relax and take a step back. They do not like workaholics. They do not like, I know you might think that that's what you should be doing, is like, you might be thinking like, why would I talk about the hiking club? That's not relevant to medicine. I assure you it is 100% relevant to medicine, and you should 100% talk about at least one hobby in your application. I always encourage everyone to have one hobby on your list. I probably wouldn't have 5 hobbies, but I would have one hobby at least. If you actually have 5 hobbies, if you could do that so well and still have 5 hobbies, then put them all in, like, maybe break them into 2 categories or something. You can also have artistic endeavors. So artistic endeavors would be things like music or art. So if you do art on a regular basis, you can put that like painting or whatever. So what counts as hobbies? I've seen everything from photography to hiking to you know, baking, if you do it significantly, like here's what I would not count as a hobby. Some people say, well, I exercise, I read, and I cook. I'm like, yeah, that sounds like life. Like you should cook your food. I mean, we all cook because we have to eat. And you exercise, like that's kind of like a thing we all should be doing. I'm not sure if it's a hobby unless you take it to another level. Like if you do CrossFit, I think that's a hobby. But if you just go and you're walking on the treadmill, you know, you go to the gym 2 or 3 times a week, to me, that doesn't seem like a hobby. That just seems like something we all should be doing. So, you know, try to take it to the next level if you're going to put it in there. Show how you, like if you cook, and you cook, you know, cook for a group of your friends, or you have a blog, like if you have a food blog, that's amazing. Put your blog link in there so they can see that you do like legit cooking. What if your hobby is traveling and you can't do that now? You can always put it backdated. So you can put that you did travel. And again, like if you have a travel blog or something, you can include that link.
I always have to include this one that I got from a student at one point. It was like 3 years ago. Competitive knife throwing. Nobody else is going to have that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
There was another question about like, now that we're online, and I think this is kind of relevant to the hobbies as well. How do we work on gaining experiences? Like if like they're just, it's hard to connect and communicate with those folks. How do we do that?
Yeah, I did email, I wrote Kyle back and included some ideas. So you're going to have to be creative, and I think sometimes it's going to be based on where you're at and what you have access to. So I'm just going to imagine me personally, if I wanted to go out and do something right now, if I wanted to volunteer in some way, what are some things I could do? Well, I know for a fact that there are a lot of women, professional women, who are working right now from home, and they're working with their kids in the background, screaming, and they're trying to do multiple things. There's a club on campus that was actually started that helps working women by taking care of children on Zoom while the mothers are working. I actually said that to many students early on, like March, April. I was like, if you want to help someone, really help someone, why don't you reach out to some women you know who are working from home with children and just volunteer to do something with their kids, play a game online, tutor their homework, do something, because it's a crisis. Like it's really, really hard to work from home with children, and you could put that on your application. I had a couple college students babysitting for me in the spring. They put that in their application. Find someone and take care of kids. You can tutor online. You can find a company to tutor for. There's this website called OutSchool, which is an online school. It's free. I mean, it's not free. People pay for it, but it's like you could join it and you could teach classes, and then you can put yourself down as a teacher. I know a lot of districts are online and they're desperate for substitute teachers because it's like teachers are missing work. So if you could be a substitute teacher, you can, I've had a lot of students do that in their gap years, but if you have flexibility in your schedule, you could do that. And then you could do online substitute teaching, or even if they have in-person school, go teach at the school. Some students are doing crisis hotline workers. I have students who are working at mental, how do I put it? Residential facilities. I don't know what the right phrase is, but working with mentally ill individuals, and they're basically behavioral techs in their facilities. You could become a personal care attendant, look at care.com and go into people's homes and work with them. I mean, there are still many, many things you can do. I get asked all the time, how can we do things with COVID? And I mean, look on indeed.com, just look for jobs. Google, someone asked about core competencies. Why don't you Google AAMC core competencies, and you will find a list of the core competencies on the website. If you take care of a family member, I probably would not put that down as an experience, because again, that's like going for a walk, right? Like if your family member is sick, you probably take care of them. However, if you get certified as a personal care attendant and you're getting paid to take care of them, then you would put it as paid employment. And I have had students who put like caring for a sick or elderly relative as a personal care attendant as a paid job, and that's totally fine. But if you're just caring for an elderly grandparent, again, I think that's like an expectation, is that you would just do that and you shouldn't get credit for it in your med school application. If you, let's say your mother has cancer and you're taking care of your mother during that time, you would probably write about that in your personal statement. Okay, so that took a long time to get to this point. Why are we doing any of this? Med schools, again, don't care what you do. There is nothing that they're looking for. All they want to know is who you are as a person. So everything that you choose to do with your time, if you're early in your career, you get to create however the world understands you. And that's amazing to think about. You want them to think you're good at something, go do it. Go find a way to do it and show that you're good at teaching people or explaining difficult concepts or speaking in front of groups. You can pick and choose how the world interprets you by doing certain things. So if you really want to go into emergency medicine, what experience might you do? Anybody? EMT. There you go. You automatically thought of that, right? You think if you love working in a crisis situation, you love the fast pace, you love touching people, you love all that, it makes sense. Go be an EMT, because that's where your mind goes. That's where their mind goes too. So you can deliberately manage that, and that's how you do this. So they like to know what you care about. If you have certain populations of people that you do care a lot about, and I did say earlier that you want to work with people different from yourself, and that's a really common secondary question. Tell us about a time when you worked with someone different from yourself, and what did you learn? So I would push you to do that at some point if you haven't done that before. Find a population you're really unfamiliar with, whether it be those experiencing homelessness, or there are just tons and tons of different populations. Pick a group different from yourself and work with them. Find some activity to do with them. Find a community service project, because that's a common question in med school apps. But let's say there is something you really do care about. Let's say you care about women's health, or you love working with children, or you love working with the elderly, cancer patients, certain communities in terms of the Black or the Hispanic community, or anything, whatever it is. Find a group and do something with that group. It doesn't have to be clinical. I've had students who went into high schools and created mentoring programs at their old high schools to help increase college attendance. Find a problem in your community and try to solve it, work towards it. Probably can't solve all these huge problems, but do something about it, right? And when they see that you did that, you took initiative and you tried to work towards a problem that you see in your own community, then they understand, like, wow, they care a lot about that. And it's going to be more convincing when you say, I really want to go back to my community and serve to close that gap. If there's a health equity gap or a health disparity, you might want to say, I want to go back and serve in that community. If you've never touched that community, they're going to be like, okay, but why didn't you do that before? Now you have time right now. Find something you can do. And like I said, it does not have to be clinical. All right, so here's the ultimate challenge, and this is a lot more fun whenever we can talk out loud. But, let me answer Simon's question real quick. How do you see engaging in something like narrative medicine? I see it as really important. I think that narrative medicine is a really important tool that a lot of med schools are teaching their medical students. So if you have a concept of that before you get there, I think it's important. Most of the students I know who focus on narrative medicine as undergrads end up being pretty successful in the process. So if you like that, if you're really into narrative medicine, then I'd say throw yourself into it, let yourself do that. All right, so we are just gonna have to do this by chat. Let's imagine that during college, the only job you could get was being a fry cook at McDonald's. Your job is to convince me, I'm a med school, that you gained experience from that job that has prepared you to be a doctor. How has being a fry cook at McDonald's like being a doctor? Go. Yep, you have to work in a fast-paced environment. What kind of problem solving? Yeah. What? Give me an example. Anybody? Okay, be specific. Imagine what that would be like. I don't know how you're going to be creative as a fry cook. Tell me what you mean, Simon. So right now you guys are staying on the surface. You guys are hovering on a surface level in terms of telling me how it makes you become a doctor. What I need is evidence. I need you to creatively think of how that is actually like being a doctor. So what we want to do is draw parallels. I want you to tell me about a situation as a fry cook that is just like being a doctor. Okay, so here's a little bit closer. Lillian says you have an unhappy customer. So customer comes in and says, customer A comes in and says, I want my fries extra salty, a little soggy. Sounds disgusting, but that's what they want. So you're like, okay, I got A, soggy and extra salty. Customer B comes in, I want my fries crispy and not salted. Customer C comes in, I want every third fry to be burned. Now imagine you're a doctor, you have patients sitting in each room, and each of those patients are going to come with a different life story, a different need. Some of them might be older, some might be younger, some might have personality disorders, some of them might be really resistant to your care. And so every single person you encounter is going to require a unique approach and really a concentrated effort in terms of who they are and what it is that they want. So as a fry cook at McDonald's, you were constantly challenged with having to tailor your work, the specialty that you did, to satisfy the needs of these unique customers with all of these, unique challenges: soggy fries, burnt fries, salted fries. I mean, you were constantly, and you had to keep track of it with detailed notes, similar to your medical records. If you failed to follow the directions in the order, then the patients or the customers are going to be unhappy, right? They're going to complain, and it's going to be unpleasant. Then you're going to have other people, down your throat. Working under pressure, yeah, things build up. How many times have you been in a doctor's office and the whole lobby is full and people are saying, well, I'm sorry, the doctor's running a little behind right now. You're supposed to start, you're supposed to meet with the doctor at 10 o'clock. You don't get in until 10:45. Same thing, right? That line, drive-through line. Have you seen drive-through lines at McDonald's at noon? It's insane. I can't imagine being a fry cook at noon. So the pressure to work fast and still pay attention to details, because even though the line is down the street, you still got your soggy fries, your burnt fries, your salted fries. Oh my gosh, In-N-Out, I can't imagine. So does it really matter if you're a fry cook, or if you are a research assistant, or if you are the best experience you think you can get? At the end of the day, your job is to convince them that you have the skills to be a good doctor. That's all you're trying to do. And it doesn't really matter what you do. No, not really. I mean, Jing, I think different experiences have different purposes. So for example, it'd be really hard for me to imagine you convincing me that hiking is just like being a doctor. Although I bet if we tried, we could, right? But that's not really probably the purpose of your hiking. Your hiking wasn't to do anything other than to relax. And that's okay, because as a doctor, you also need to relax. What are the ramifications if you never relax as a doctor? Yeah, and they can't have physician burnout. They need you to be at work. And also you'll get tired, you'll get cranky with your patients. Even, the best people, I know I've had days where, I think I'm generally pretty okay, nice wise, but when I've had like 10 appointments in a row and I haven't eaten and I'm tired, I'm trying to be nice, but there's just a little bit of edge that comes out because I'm tired, right? When you're tired, sometimes it's really hard to be your best self because you haven't eaten, you're tired, you have to go to the bathroom, you've already dealt with so many cranky people all day. So taking care of yourself is really, really important. All right, so we talked about this already, and this is what I'd like you all to do right now at whatever stage you are. I'd like you to go ahead and get that Google Doc going, number 1 through 15, and just start listing out what you've done. And if you have already done 15 and you're applying this spring, then I want you to take it to the next level, and I want you to go ahead and write out your 700 characters. I would do your 700 characters for Amcas first, and then for a COMIS, if you're doing both MD and DO, you can cut it down to 600 later, but go ahead and do your 700. And as soon as you have that done, and you don't have to have them all done, but as soon as you have some of them done, go ahead and make an appointment with an HPA advisor and start getting those looked at. Again, people usually will have their personal statements read 20 times, which is great, but they'll neglect this part. And we're going to actually prompt you, if you have an appointment with us, we're going to say, where are your experiences? Because that writing is just as important. when you're getting your experiences put together, you need to make sure you collect all of this information. They're going to ask you for this. And so it's nice if you have an Excel sheet that has all of this already documented. For the contact person, it is very, very unlikely that they would ever contact your contact. However, in the weird case that they do, I would not put a peer who is also applying to med school. So this becomes relevant for some of the clubs. And if you're in a club like AMSA or MAPS or any of the AMWA, any of the big kind of pre-med clubs, I would make sure that your cohort of people who are applying from that club that year all talk to one another and decide on a person to list as your contact. For AMSA and MAPS, I have been that person for a few years, and so it doesn't matter who it is, but don't list each other. Don't put all different contacts. And I mean, you can imagine just conflict of interest wise, why it might not be in your best interest to list one of your competitors as your contact person on your med school app. So just put an adult, if you can find an adult, like an advisor or someone like that. They are not going to contact them, but it's just good to have everybody have the same person listed. Dates, again, oh, I didn't say this actually. So most experiences you start and you end, but sometimes you do experiences where you do it for 3 different summers. And so you actually have 3 different date ranges. Just in Amcas, you can actually break up for each experience, you can add up to 3 date ranges. So if you did it, you know, just during the summers for 3 years in a row, you can just put, you know, June to August 3 times with those date ranges. And then the hours get calculated just for those 3 dates, rather than listing, you know, from the 1st June all the way through the 3rd August 3 years later, when you really only spent 3 years doing it or 3 months doing it each year. You might just break it up like that. Does that make sense to everybody? Because you have to calculate hours based on your average weekly. So it becomes a little complicated if you don't break it out. So I'm going to pause for a minute. Does anybody have any questions about this? Because this usually causes some concern. No questions? Okay. You can ask anytime too. How about shadowing when you shadow multiple doctors? Yeah, so virtual shadowing is great. You would just put the person's name, and if you don't have their contact information, if you can't get their contact information, I would put whoever can speak to the fact that you were there. So I know like Dr. Ryan Gray hosts some e-shadowing. If you happen to do it and you didn't get the physician's name that you were e-shadowing, then you can ask him if you could put his email as the contact. I don't know if he's up for that, but you can definitely try that. If you really don't have a contact, then you don't have a contact. You just put yourself. There's nothing really you can do about that. And it's not like you're gonna not get into med school because of that. It's just, you know, it looks a little fishy if you don't have anybody's contact. You probably wouldn't want to use yourself a lot. You definitely would use yourself for your hobbies though. That makes more sense. But if you shadowed, let's say you shadowed 3 different doctors, you could put each doctor as their own experience. But if you plan on grouping all 3 doctors into the same experience, 700 characters, and just putting it as like one, you could just pick whichever one you want. And then you could put in the description that you shadowed these 3 doctors with these date ranges, just kind of like listing it out. And then if you have space, you can just add a sentence or 2 about how, like what you learned from it. It's 3 date ranges per experience. So if you, I'm guessing not many of your experiences are going to be broken out like that. So I'm not sure if there's a cap. It's not usually an issue. If you have however many with different date ranges, you could do that. How many hours would be enough? It really depends on what you want to do. Nobody's managing at that level. It's just like if you did a really impactful experience and it was only 8 hours, then I would put it in like a conference or something like that. If you only went to something and stayed 2 hours, I mean, it's totally up to you. If you really feel like that's, you know, was significant, then you want to put it. I always just defer back to the student in terms of what you want to do. For HRIs, it's actually supposed to be the manager at the hospital that you would put as your contact person. And I think that changes sometimes by year. You can ask the ICC who that person is by the year. And can being a poll worker during an election? Yeah, absolutely. I would 100% put that. Who would be the point of contact if you attended conferences? You could put like one of the coordinators for the conference, like the person who confirmed things with you or the person who invited you. If you have like a email from the conference, like a confirmation email, who it came from, you could put that as the email. Then if anyone, I mean, no one is ever going to email those people and say, did this person really attend the conference? I mean, that's never going to happen. But if they did, that would be the group that would confirm it, right? Is the one who sent you the confirmation. If clinic activity was suspended during last spring and then continued late in the summer, should we break down the dates? I probably would, because otherwise you're going to have to just average out the hours over the span of time you weren't doing it. It'll make it look like you just did like 1 or 2 hours a week, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So I would just do that. I would have different date ranges for that. This is outside of experiences. Under a club. You wouldn't. Someone asked, how do you get a rec letter if there's no adult for your club? Well, you don't need I'm not sure why you would even get a letter of rec for your club. You don't need a letter of rec. These are not references. This is just a contact. So they're not going to contact these people. If you have no adult, no advisor for your club, you can ask an advisor at HPA to be listed. That's totally fine. Like, we don't have any problem being listed on your application for that purpose. So you just list our information. You can list me or any of the advisors if you've worked with us. If an experience has multiple emails for a point of contact, no, just pick one. Again, they're not going to email them. It's just filling out the application. You put down the hours as hours per week. Yes. So if you are not sure, you can go into the Amcas handbook. Every year Amcas puts together like a 60-page handbook, which is really nice. And you can just search for the experiences section and you can see how it's broken out. Like, they'll explain in detail how to do it. I'm not sure if you already went over this. Fire alarms went off. We had to help fire department with hobbies. You're saying, Diana, that you helped the firefighters when the fire alarm went off? I guess I would just wonder, like,
I think she stepped away because of the fire alarms, and so missed.
Oh, I was like, is that an experience? I am not sure how we would do that. Okay, perfect. Glad that wasn't your question. What hobbies are appropriate to list? Whatever you want. Like I said before, I probably wouldn't put things like eating, sleeping, exercising, reading, because those are types of things that we should always probably do anyway. But anything else you want to do is totally fine. Yeah, thanks, Doug. I love the applicant guide. I always print a copy and keep it on my desk because things change every year, and it's not like I get a text message when they do change. So sometimes I figure things out as we go along because it's a pretty big application and there are a lot of pages to it, a lot of nuanced questions. And so if you are filling it out and you're just like, I have no idea what this is about, then you can either hit up the guide or you can shoot us an email. You can also communicate directly with Amcas if you're really struggling, but they have really great tutorials. They have these little videos embedded in the application you can watch. I have never met anyone who just can't figure out how to fill out the application. I mean, you're all trying to be doctors, so you should be able to figure this out. And they make it really, really easy, like user-friendly. Is being a freelance makeup artist? Yes, that's awesome. I would totally put that. I've had people who've done nails put in their hobby. You know, I think I told you all once that, I mean, the med schools, they just love all kinds of things. Like anything that you've done, they just like to know who you are as a person. I once saw a person who got into med school because she was a tattoo artist. I've had seen students in the past who dressed up like clowns and performed for children in hospitals. There's just so many things you could do. It's nobody cares. Just do whatever you love to do. That's the most important thing. If you love doing makeup, find a way to do something meaningful with it. Maybe you could do, like, if you can get into a hospital, maybe you could volunteer to do like makeovers for teenagers with cancer or something. Like, find a way to do something with it that gives your talent to other people. And I think that's always important if you can. When we're talking about our 3 meaningful experiences for Amcas, this is the actual prompt that appears in Amcas, but I shorten it. So I I tell you to answer the question, how did it change you? This is the prompt. What is the transformative nature of your experience? How did it change you is different than what did you do? So the 700 characters is what did you do? Tell me what you did in it. And sometimes people will do like one sentence that's a big overview of what you did, and then maybe a bullet or two or a sentence or two of like really technical things, and then a sentence that's really big picture, like what did I learn from this experience? I kind of like that. I think if you could put something that you learned from each experience in your description, I love that. But if you can't, because there's just so much you did and it's just so important, then just put whatever you want. There's not a right or wrong way to do this. There's not a standard. It's just whatever you put is how they understand you. So some people feel like, you know, the type of things they did are really typical and don't really share a lot about them, but what they learned is what sets them apart from other people. So they focus more of the writing on what did they learn, what did they take away from the experience, and that's totally fine. Just like focusing on the technical work you did is totally fine too. But again, that's very different than how did it change you. So when you think about writing your meaningful experience, I want you to think about yourself on the first day of the experience and compare yourself to the last day of the experience and identify some growth area. So maybe it was, wow, when I started this experience, I was really nervous working with the homeless population. I had never had that experience. I hadn't had a lot of exposure to poverty. I was really anxious when I first went in and did a discussion with them. However, over the course of a year and a half, my comfort level grew, and then focused on some really specific competencies. What do you now understand that's going to help you in your future? So maybe you can apply it just to that population, but maybe you could expand it bigger. You could say, I understand now that anytime I come in contact or work with somebody who's very different from myself, that it requires that I do this, this, and this in order to build that rapport very quickly. It took me a whole year to practice that skill, but now I'm really comfortable doing it. And now I can do that with all kinds of people. So you take this experience and you show how you changed. You're not just taking the experience and bragging about how awesome of an experience it was. You're not telling me how important this research is, or how competitive it was to get that research assistant job and how special you are because you got it. That is not what they're asking. They are asking, how did you grow from it? So people who are very me centric in the sense of like, look how important I am, look how special I am, look how great I am. Those are the people that get on their nerves and they fall through the cracks. Because if you can imagine out of 6,000 person applicant pool, how many pre-meds will naturally default to doing that in their application? Just imagine out of 6,000, how many people will naturally want to tell the med schools how important and special they are? Any guess? I mean, 4,000, 3,000, a lot of them. If you don't do that and you take a different approach, you are going to be what we call refreshing. You're going to be someone who has a different voice, who is like, I'm not, I don't walk on water. This is how I failed. This is how I struggled. This is how I grew. This is how I am ready to do this thing now, because I can reflect and self-assess, and I can be really insightful about myself and about the world and about humanity. It's those types of reflections and insights that they're looking for. And I always tell people that it doesn't matter what you did. They're not measuring what you did. They're measuring what's in your head. And it's what you say that matters, not what you did. Does that make sense to everybody? So I think sometimes as undergrads, we get really caught up on, because you guys are all around each other and you push each other, and that's great. You all push each other to do better and be better and do these great things, and that's amazing. But when you lose focus of why you're doing it, and you think you're only doing it because you need to sound impressive and you're trying to impress people around you, now you've lost track of the point. So never lose track. The point is to build yourself. You're trying to make yourself better. You can't be better if you're already great to start with, right? So you got to be a little humble. You've got to show how you grew and how you changed. Med schools love that stuff. They love failure, by the way. If you failed, you want to talk about failing. Okay, so here I have a sample piece of writing I'm going to show you next. And, oh, I see a question. Should we try and stay away from a resume bullet point summary and keep it more of a reflection? I've seen people do it effectively both ways. My favorite way is to see, like I said, a sentence that's kind of big picture. You know, at the student run clinic, we served this population, did these things, and then maybe a bullet, two dashes, because you can't use bullets literally, but 2 dashes of like some transactional things you did, and then a big picture takeaway of what did you learn from that experience, or how it you know, impacted you the most. I like that, but it's just my personal preference. It's not the best way. I have seen people do it really, really well in a dozen different ways. You need to figure out which one is the best for you, and then make sure you do all 15 the same way. That's probably the most important. Doing it consistently across the board. That way they don't think it's a mistake. Because if you do, you know, if you do one like a full paragraph written in complete sentences, and then the next one you do like a full paragraph, but you do short clauses. So rather than writing in complete sentences, you start each one with the past tense verb. Then it looks like you don't know what you're doing, and you can't write, right? Because you forgot the pronouns in your second paragraph. But if you do it the same, if every single paragraph doesn't have complete sentences and you start with the past tense verb, like coordinated, blah, 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 planned this, collaborated with, and you just run those together as one bulk sentence, one bulk paragraph, that's totally fine if you're deliberate about it and you know what you're doing and you do it the same way. Does that make sense? So, okay, so I'm going to show you this piece of writing, and I'm going to give you a minute to read, and then I just want you, as you think of things or after you're done reading, I want you to post in the chat, what are some of your thoughts about the writing, okay? So this only works as a discussion if you participate. Here we go. So what in the first sentence does that person not need to say? What in the first sentence does that person not need to write? Yep, Courtney, you said spent 2 years. So why do we not need to say I spent 2 years working in the clinic? This is where I wish I could unmute all of you because I really would like to hear you talk. Yeah, they have the dates. The time is listed right above. They actually have your title. They have health educator as the title and the experiences, and they also have the name of the clinic because you have to put the organization name. So this is 692 characters. So this is basically it, right? You don't have a lot of space to say all the things that you did. So characters are currency. You really want to use your characters wisely. If you don't need to say it, don't say it. Okay, so first sentence, we agree. Maybe we would talk about, instead of saying underserved population, maybe we can name the population, right? Because we know that the student-run clinics are different. So wouldn't it be valuable to be able to see or know who it is that they served? So maybe we'd be more specific. What about the second sentence? We made a huge impact on the community. I wonder if that community is different today because of this person. Do you think it is? Probably not, right? The community is probably the same. Now, what did they have a huge impact on? Potentially. Maybe some people, right? Maybe they really helped some people. They probably served and really made a difference in some people's lives, but they probably did not change the community. It's a really important distinction. Some days our clinic was so busy we had to turn people away. Now, I always have a couple people in my group who have actually volunteered at one of the student-run clinics. And what does a busy day look like at Imani? How many people do you serve? Anybody? How about any of the other clinics? What's a busy day for you? Nobody here? You have less than 30 or more than 30. Oh, that's pretty good. Sometimes the clinic is like 10. Yeah, that's what I heard mostly from different people. So for a group of undergrads running a clinic, that's impressive, right? That's significant. But if I'm a medical doctor and you're telling me that your busy day was a 10-person day, I'm probably thinking, what? Like, wow, if only I had only 10 patients in a day, because they probably see like 50 to 60 a day. So, you know, if you're opening up a can of worms like that, I probably would be careful about saying things like you were turning people away, things like that, because if they really unpack that with you, like if you got an interview and they were asking you about that, and then you had to explain like, oh yeah, we had 10 people that day, they'd probably be like, what are you, you know, but you know, without context, they might not understand you had such a limited staff and all that. So I probably just wouldn't even go there. And I agree. I'd probably saying turn people away is not the best thing. But you could say, what's another way of saying that? Well, we can come back to that. We tried to serve as many people as possible, offering information about healthy choices. That sounds pretty good. You're telling them what they did. I worked alongside doctors, PAs, medical students. Little braggadocious there, huh? I was able to do a lot of hands-on care. Wow. Like taking blood pressure and glucose checks. Nice. I probably would have just said I took blood pressure and glucose checks and not said a lot of hands-on care, because that's a waste of characters. I learned a lot from this experience. Why tell me that? Why don't you just tell me what you learned? Why don't you just say, I learned something? I would urge you all to not say the last line. It solidified my desire to become a doctor. Did you do that experience just to solidify your desire? Why don't you just say what you learned? And we already believe you that you want to be a doctor. You don't have to keep beating us over the head over and over that you really, really want to be a doctor and telling us specifically which experiences made you want to be a doctor more than others. That, I mean, again, like you took the Mcat, you spent $3,000 to apply, like we get it, you want to be a doctor, no question about that. So instead of spending characters telling me over and over, I really want to be a doctor, say, this is how I'm going to be an excellent doctor. Okay, so this is an example of a really basic experience that I have seen a million times. This is how most people come in. I'm going to share with you an example of someone who got into multiple med schools, mostly UCs, and this is how she wrote her Amani Clinic description. Go ahead and post your reactions in the chat. Yeah, there's usually a lot of snapping going on in live sessions. Okay, so do you see the difference? The first one is braggy, right? The first one is about how important that person is. It's really focusing on how important the experience was. It's sort of like your typical pre-med approach to, I just want them to understand like, this was important, I am important, we're all important, we do important things, right? Versus what does she literally say in the second one? Like the opposite. I am so not important. Like this is, we're a Band-Aid fix to a larger problem. For whatever reason, this one was, I don't know what happened to the other one. I mean, they could have gotten into med school too. I probably edited it a lot though before they submitted it. But this one, I know for a fact she got it. She's down at UC San Diego right now. She also got into UC Davis. She was very successful in this cycle. Do I need to go on and on about why this is better? Does anybody have any I guess, thoughts about any concerns about this one that we should talk about? Like do you see this as being problematic in any way? Yeah, I'm reading some of your comments. Oh, I mean, it was within 700. I don't know exactly, but it's, if you look at this and we look at this, it's roughly the same. I think the font is slightly bigger, so it's probably a little bit less than the 692, I'm guessing, but I wouldn't have put it in here if it's more than 700. I mean, you can say a lot with 700. It just depends on how you use your characters. Again, we look at this one, I just think there was so much here that didn't need to be said, so much fluff and stuff. And I sometimes I get a little cranky when I'm reading writing and I say things like, this is nonsense. Like, if you tell me that this thing is going to make you a better doctor, I'm like, don't say that to me, right? Just tell me tell me what you bring to the table. Don't fill it with kind of fluffy stuff that doesn't really say anything. I consider this last line, this solidified my desire to become a doctor. That's fluff and stuff. This is substance. So again, it's not about the experience. It's about what's in your head. Okay, here's another piece of writing. I don't think it's terrible. Oh, Jane, we're gonna talk all about personal statements in January. I'm gonna poof. Yes, 100%. We are not talking about experiences in your personal statement. If you have any thoughts or reflections after this one, feel free to post those. Lucy, I think that's a really good question. What I would try to do is, rather than directly saying, this thing about healthcare right now is broken, or this thing right now is severely flawed, which this other person did get away with doing that. But anytime you can, I guess, what I would try to do is focus on yourself and focus on what you want to do. So instead of saying, when my grandpa was in the hospital, this, and this really bad thing happened, and I want to be a doctor because I want to make sure that never happens again. First of all, you can't stop other people from suffering by being a doctor. There's always going to be bad doctors, even if you're a doctor. So what you would say instead is, when I watched my grandfather in the hospital, I noticed that when physicians only spent 5 minutes talking about him in the room as if he wasn't there, my grandfather often felt, or my grandfather, you can't say how people feel, that's the other thing. My grandfather also expressed feeling, left out or frustrated at not understanding his healthcare. As a physician, I want to make sure that I take the time to always explain the reasoning behind the medical decisions to both the family and the patient, or something like that. Like, I would never talk, I never want to talk about a patient as if they're not there when they're sitting right in front of me. I mean, that's a really common thing that happens. And so, if you saw something that really bothered you, rather than just kind of berating the physician that you saw it happen with, or talking about, that it happens everywhere, just talk about what you want to do. Focus on yourself. I had a student this cycle who was also very, very successful, and I loved her personal statement because it was so basic. This is what she wrote about. She said that when she becomes a physician, she will take into consideration her patient's needs. Wow, what a concept. She talked about when she was a patient one time, she noticed that she got really nauseous. And so when she's with a patient and, or when the girl, I can't remember, it was her, I think, she was talking about when you move the gurney too fast, nauseous patients feel worse. So when you're pushing the gurney, push it slower, go around the corner slower, don't have a lot of smells, don't wear perfume in the room, don't like, I mean, it was so simple, but it was like the kind of stuff that no one talks about. It's the kind of stuff that makes such a difference when someone isn't feeling well. And she like broke it down to like the most basic level. And she's like, all it boils down to is I commit to always being considerate of my patients, and I will always put their needs before mine. And again, she has 6 interviews so far and 2 acceptances, and that is literally what she wrote about in her personal statement. It was not, she had very little clinical experience. She did mostly research, and it's just so simple, but still so profound in the way she reflected about it. And I wish that for everybody, is that we can move away from thinking that it has to be so impressive and just really get down to the heart of what humanity is about, right? Like this person, what I like about this example of writing is actually the last line. I learned that setting aside your own personal agenda is the best way to meet patient needs. And this person had talked about in other places of his app how when he first started working in hospice, he had a very specific view of end of life. He thought that we should always try to save everybody, and that, you know, if somebody can be saved, we should try. And what he realized working in hospice is that a lot of people don't want to be saved. They don't want to end their life going through painful medical treatment. They actually would prefer to just die in their own homes with their family. And he said at first that was really shocking to him, that people would rather die than get medical care. But after so much time talking with patients, he realized that that's really common, and that a really good healthcare provider should respect people's end of life plans and not try to push their own agenda onto them. And so it was a really reflective, the whole application was so kind of centered around like that similar kind of philosophy or theme, respecting patients' wishes, things like that. And so this was just supporting that, and that's why I liked it so much. Someone asked, is this too much about the grandfather rather than the experience? I feel like this is more about what the person took away from it than about the experience. Again, I'm just gonna say this like a million times. No one cares about your experience. It's not about the experience. There's nothing you've done that's going to impress them through your experiences. That sounds so mean. But if you understand that, then you're going to be very successful in this process. If you understand that it's not the experience, it's not what you did, it's what you learned and what you took away. You only did the experiences so that you could grow as a person, not because you're just trying to check off a box that you did this awesome, cool, amazing experience.
Can I add one thing to that about the word learned? Because I think there's some confusion about when you say I learned something, a lot of times it's easy to slip into saying I learned how to do this and how to do this and how to do this and how to do this, when what I think what Joanne might be meaning is what you learned about yourself and what you learned about the world and other things. So it's not just what you learned like task wise, it's deeper than that.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have like I said before, if you have like a really cool transactional thing you learn, like a technical skill, you take up one line in there, by all means put it in there, but it's really about you as a person. Also, I'm going to just put this out there because it's a really big pet peeve of mine. It's learned, not learned. I Googled it because I was like, so many people write learnt and I don't know where that came from. And it says in Google that you can technically use either one. I have a bachelor's and a master's in English. I have never heard of the word learnt before I came to UC Davis. I don't know. I'm kind of old school, and I think there's going to be a lot of old school people out there. I probably would use learned. I don't know. Would anybody like to advocate on behalf of learnt right now?
Absolutely not.
I see it everywhere. All the students write learnt, and I'm like, where in the world did this come from? It's not in, it was never taught to me. I took all the linguistics courses. I took all the grammar courses. I swear to you, every year people use learnt all over the place. So if you're having me or Doug read your writing, just a heads up, go ahead and change those learnts to learned before you get to us, because we're going to chop it up if you give it to us. And I'm telling you, a lot of people who are going to be reading your app are going to be in their 50s and 60s, and they don't use the word learnt, I promise. So I probably wouldn't do that. All right, so kind of addressing the pros things. I think we talked about this before and we're getting close to time. Will help you when you get to this point, when you're talking about writing, the literal writing part will help you edit it and give you some ideas for how to make sure it's not repetitive across the 15 experiences. But I always encourage you to think about your verbs and mix it up. Try to be creative. Try not to just use the same thing over and over, like I guess creative, coordinated, collaborated, those are really common ones. But if you can think more specifically about what you did and drill it down more, I think that just makes the writing a little bit better. And if you're getting started, well, if we had time, and actually this was built for in-person, we would have you do a little sample writing yourself, but you can do this on your own. Pick an experience, write your description, think in your head about what attributes or competencies you would like someone to get from that experience, and then let someone read it. Don't ever give your writing to someone and say, what do you think? Because that's not a good question to ask. Give them your writing and say, what do you understand about me as a result of reading this? So if they say, if you say, what competencies do you understand about me now? And then they know what they're giving you, what answer they're giving you, right? So then they'll say, oh, well, I understand you're good at public speaking, or I think from this, I get that you're really good at problem solving. And if that's the competency you had intended for, you won. Great, your writing is fantastic. If they're telling you something way out in left field, like, oh, I think that means you can drive tractors really well. And you're like, oh, no, I was trying to say I have capacity for improvement. Well, you got to go back to your writing, right? And manipulate that writing a little bit better so that the people who are reading it get exactly what you want from it. You have to control your writing so that every single person you give it to comes away with the same understanding about you. That way, when you give it to 30 different med schools, you can try to control a little bit more about what they're understanding about you. And so you do that. That's how you get people to help you. But don't just, like I said, don't just give it to your friends and be like, here, tell me what you think. You do not want to know what everybody thinks about you. Trust me, it's a can of worms you don't want to open. So just ask really specific questions and you'll get the answers you're looking for. There's a lot of really technical stuff about experiences, like I said, in the Amcas guide. This was some of it that I pulled out. This was the thing about entering multiple date ranges. And then I pulled this out too. This is really so silly. In Amcas, and for all of the writing you do for your personal statement and for experiences, you need to copy and paste your writing out of a Word doc and put it in a text only, like a notebook or notepad, and then copy and paste it directly into Amcas. Don't copy and paste from a Word doc into Amcas. There's some HTML for whatever reason, and on the other side, if you use like parentheses or anything, it'll show funky characters. You won't see it, but they see it on the other side. I hope they fixed it in the years that since I left the med school, but if you read the Amcas guidebook, it actually says this in there, but no one reads the guidebook, so no one knows to do this, I'm telling you. I remember when I was working for my supervisor in the med school, she was a neuroradiologist, very, very specific lady. She, every time would get so mad because there'd be all these weird characters in the personal statement, and she'd be like, Joanne, get this fixed. And I'm like, I cannot fix this. This is the students. They did not do it right. I mean, there's nothing I can do at that point. But she would get so irritated. So if you don't want to irritate your reader, don't do that. Copy and paste it into a text or a notepad. Then you can get rid of those funky characters. Yep, we'll post all of this on the, we'll post this video on our Facebook page. And I believe we're putting the PowerPoints on the website, if I'm not mistaken. If we haven't, we will soon.
We haven't, but I will get those added.
Cool. All right, so we have a couple of minutes before we take a break. Does anyone have any questions? I can unmute you if you'd like to ask questions. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see. If you'd like to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you and let you talk.
Evelyn.
It doesn't look like I have the ability to let her talk. Can you do that, Doug?
I could do that. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So can you repeat the last part? I don't understand. What do you mean copy and paste from where to where?
Yeah, so in like a normal Word doc or a Google Doc, it's possible that there's some HTML built into that. I'm not really I don't really understand all that, but this is what was said to me. So there is usually on most computers, there's like a notepad function. I think you should have it on your computer. Just look up on your app's notepad and then just copy the text from the Word doc or the Google Doc into the notepad. And from what I understand, that eliminates all the HTML, and then copy and paste it out of the notepad into your application.
Okay, now I understand better. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I know that's a really weird thing, but it's a thing.
We have a question in the chat box.
Oh yeah. How can we write about an experience that you plan for your gap year? It's a great question. If you start the experience after you submit your application, you can't. It's not going to go in your application. So what you could do is write about it in your secondaries if you started it between submitting your app and doing your secondaries, or you can update the schools by sending them an email and letting them know that you started this experience. But for the most part, your gap year activities do not go in your application. Gap year activities are not intended to boost your application. They're just intended to like maybe help if you have to reapply or kill time or do something you enjoy. So they're not supposed to be like, if you're lacking experience, you can't count on your gap year activity to build that up. Does that answer the question? Cool. How common is it to take a gap year? Very, very common. You know, truthfully, I haven't really done I haven't looked at the stats, but anecdotally, each year, I mean, I might know one person who goes straight through. I would say at least 80–90% of our applicants take a gap year. There are no cons to taking a gap year. The only there are lots of pros. The pros would be you have your 4th year grades. You have another year to prep for the Mcat in terms of the coursework you take. So if you are trying to go straight through, you are basically applying at the end of your spring or end of your 3rd year, in the spring of your 3rd year. So you have to try to squeeze the Mcat in sometime during your 3rd year while you're taking courses, unless you do it during the summer after your 2nd year, but that's insane trying to take biochem in your 2nd year. So you just have a whole nother year. You could take, if you go take a gap year, you could take your Mcat at the summer after your 3rd year and then prep your application over your 4th year. You're also, if you're going straight through, worrying about, interviewing and getting accepted and getting your financial aid and finding housing. So a lot of people move out of state from med school. You're doing all that during your 4th year. You graduate the middle of June, you start med school at the end of July. Like there's no time, there's no breathing, there's nothing. You're just running. Deanna, that's a great question. No, a post-bac is post-bac. It's not a gap year. Sometimes you have to do a gap year after post-bac because you're applying. I also don't really think, so when you are, let's say you're taking a traditional 1-year gap year, you're going to apply in the spring that you're graduating. So you graduate in June and you're hitting submit that month. So that summer after you graduate, you're doing secondaries. And then you're going to get interviews from, let's say, September all the way through March. So that whole time, you're mentally going to be very absorbed in that process. Now you have to stay busy because you'll literally lose your mind if you don't. You have to stay busy, you have to get a job, you have to do things because you just have to. And so you're going to be worrying about your app, you're going to be prepping interviews. Then after, interview season ends in March, then you may be accepted by that point, or you may not be accepted. You might be waitlisted, in which case you're still stressing out, waiting to hear back if you get off the wait list. People get accepted to med school all the way through July, a year after you applied. People can get accepted to med school a week before orientation, actually a day before orientation. I have had students who got accepted, they're in California, they got accepted to schools in North Carolina days before orientation. They literally dropped everything and moved to North Carolina with like a day's notice. It happens every single year, all over the country. That's a thing. So the process is just really stressful, unpredictable, uncontrollable. And so it's better for some people just to do that during a year off rather than do that whole thing while you're taking a full load of courses your 4th year. I personally just can't imagine trying to handle all of that stress while you're also taking courses. Okay, so I think we're out of time. It was really great chatting with all of you today. I hope that was helpful, and I hope you stick around for the Mcat. If you, we're going to be closing down, HPA will be closing down December 18th for 2 weeks. I think the whole campus is closing down, so we won't be available. But I think we're back early in January with our next MedPrep session, and I'm going to be talking about personal statements, which is something I really love. So hope you're going to join us for that. It'll be a lot of fun, and have a really great winter break. I will see you all next year. Goodbye.
And somebody asked if when HPA was going to have more appointments. We did open up several more, a bunch of us. So you might check again now, and you might be able to find something before that curtailment time. And I just looked it up. Learnt apparently is a UK English word, and learned with ED is a US English word. So
good to know. Does it make it better?
I know. Well, don't be writing UK English in US and vice versa. So anyways, the recording will be on YouTube and also on the main MedPrep site and also on the Facebook page. So keep an eye out. I'll post the link to all three places mid next week. So and I'll also get the slides up. I apologize for not having the slides up. I didn't realize we were doing that. So I will get the slides up for all the previous sessions as well. And go ahead and take a break. We're going to take about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have Rain get ready to present a little bit about the Mcat. So it looks like we're talking about physics today. So go ahead and take your break, and Rain, you should have access to share slides. So go ahead and test that out, please.
Great. Alrighty, let me get everything set up. Hear me all right?
We can hear you.
Great.
And the question for Joanne, are we going to keep the drop-ins at the same time at 2 p.m. Tuesday is next quarter? I think we are.
Yeah, we are.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
And then if for those of you who are applying this coming spring, we'll also be hosting an application prep series every Monday at 12 p.m. and I'll be at all of those. And so we have different staff members presenting, but I'll be there to answer questions. So if you want to block, if you are applying this spring and you want to go ahead and block Mondays at 12, it would be great to have you at all those series too. We will be covering a lot of the same information we're doing here, but if you're going along, you just want a refresher, or you want to see us and talk about applications, that's where another place you can get to us.
Excellent. All right, it looks like we've got the video working, or the sharing working for Rain. So we'll be back here at 10:45, and we will get started at that time. All righty, so it is time to introduce Rain. He is a Princeton Review teacher, teaches physics, and he's going to give us a little bit of a short lesson on physics. And I'm going to pass the reins over to Rain now. So welcome, and thank you for coming today.
Great, thank you so much, Doug. Yep, so hello everyone, my name's Rain. I'm a teacher at the Princeton Review. So, you know, a little bit about me. I'm a student here at UC Davis. Contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm still a student here. I will be for the remainder of the year. My email is this rmmilner@UC Davis. As far as my background, you know, what makes me qualified to teach, I got my undergraduate in physics, and I'm currently now a master's student here at Davis studying mechanical engineering. So, you know, Princeton Review, all of our teachers are experts in their subject matter. So I'm a physics expert. I don't know a ton about the other subjects. So if you have questions about that, right, that's not going to be my area of expertise, but that's all right. So let me just get, so some questions for you all, and feel free to send in the chat or just kind of think about these yourself. You know, do you like physics? I ask this question at the beginning of all my courses, and I usually get a mixed response. Physics is pretty polarizing. I totally understand that. You know, hard subject. Some people love it, some people hate it. A lot of people hate it. I hate it. No, it's fine. So have you taken all your physics classes for the Mcat? That's another question you should ask yourself. And for a UC Davis student, that would mean 3/4, right? The first introductory sequence. I know there's a med focused sequence here at Davis, 3/4. So you get through all of those, you're prepared. It's very fundamental material, right? Nothing, I mean, it does go all the way to modern physics, so it is a lot of material, but nothing, not too much content. All right. Other stuff, so feel free to ask questions. You know, I'm watching the chat here, so feel free to ask me questions in the chat. We're going to try and make this a little bit interactive. Today, we're really going to go through a mini lesson, what it would be like to be in a physics classroom with me, you know, learning the Mcat, preparing for that big test. Obviously, we don't normally give them as PowerPoint presentations. There is an online portal, and you know, it's interactive, it's useful. I really like it. I think students enjoy working in it. If it weren't COVID times, then we teach in a few different locations around Davis. Sometimes I teach above the Coho, and there's some other rooms we teach in, and there are classes in Sacramento as well. Yeah. So let's go ahead and start talking about physics. So we really are going to get into some physics today. What is our agenda? We're going to talk about some of the most important math and very prerequisite concepts that we need to understand math on the Mcat, physics on the Mcat. And remember that there aren't calculators, right? There are no calculators on the Mcat. So if you've been used to plugging and chugging for your undergraduate career, you got to kind of back that up. Remember your multiplication, remember your division, your scientific notation. So those skills are very important. As a part of that, we're going to talk about units and dimensions. Again, a fundamental concept, but very important for getting answers correct. I mean, a very useful skill for checking your answers and making sure that you're correct. And then we're going to talk about some very physicsy concepts, kinematics, right? Motion, mass, forces, and Newton's laws. So let's get into it. Okay, so getting into some of these prerequisite physics concepts, math concepts, the first topic I want to talk about is proportions and proportionality. Proportions are a way to relate two variables without necessarily talking about the equation that describes them, okay? And they do a lot of things for us. So they can help us give a shape of a curve, of a graph, and they can help us answer questions with, like I said, without necessarily fully understanding the equation. And this is a good way to answer questions. It really is a good way to get answers correct without necessarily knowing everything about the problem. Okay, so here's a very good example, a very common example. What happens to the area of a circle if our radius doubles? Okay, what happens? So we know a few things. Hopefully, we know our area formula for a circle, pi r squared, right? Where r is radius, area is a, and pi is our constant, 3.14. That was step one. We found the equation that relates to the two variables. That's not absolutely necessary. We could also write something like this. Area is proportional to r squared, right? Step two, identify all the constants or effective constants, right? In this case, we have pi, but effective constants could be variables that we know the value of. That would be another option. Right, an equation is a proportion, right? So this actually goes right down here. And now here's where, you know, it really becomes a problem. Plug in the factor by which the independent variable is changing. Okay, so if we are doubling our radius, let's plug in that a value of 2 in for r and see what happens. Well, if we plug in a 2 for r, we get a 2 squared, right? That equals 4. And what that means is that area is going to increase by a factor of 4, right? And so that's, again, just a basic concept. You know, this is a basic equation, but it can get more complicated, and this can be very useful when equations become very tricky. Okay. Ooh, don't like that. 1 second. Sorry about this. Let me just clear that out. Okay. So getting into more math, like I said, there's no calculator on the Mcat. We need to have a lot of this stuff totally organized in our paper, because we do not want to introduce quantities that are going to give us trouble down the line. And so what I mean is that in our classrooms, we emphasize that you should always convert your units to Scientific International, SI units, at all, you know, at any time where it's possible. They're not going to give you, like, you know, a foot and expect you to convert it to a meter off the spot. They're typically going to give you a conversion factor for that. But what I mean is that we want to make sure that all of our units are in the SI base unit. For physics, right, a little different for chemistry, that's meter, kilogram, second, coulomb. Okay, and each of these, they measure length, mass, time, and charge. That means if we have a derived unit, for example, volume. Volume is not a liter in physics. Volume is a meter cubed. We need to make sure that our units are those kept in those SI base units, right? We don't talk about liters in physics. We talk about meters cubed. That's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. You know, and this goes into all derived units. Speed is units meters per second. Density, kilograms per meter cubed, right? That's where your volume comes into play. That's meters cubed. Work, etc. All quantities are going to be kept in those SI base units. And that just helps your math down the line, right? If you make sure that you start with those quantities, you don't have to think about, oh, what happens if I square meters? And, you know, if I square centimeters, now I have this weird conversion factor that's left over. Don't want to deal with that. Tying in with that are metric prefixes. These are something that you have to memorize as an Mcat student, right? Most of us know the basic ones: kilometer, right? 10 to the 3, millimeter, 10 to the negative 3. But we also need to know pico, nano, giga, mega, right? All of these, typically they do the lower end of the spectrum, nano, micro, but I have seen megagrams on an exam before. So these are all quantities that you need to have memorized. And tying off of that, tying into that, we need to make sure that we're maintaining a scientific notation throughout, and that is, again, to make sure that we don't make careless errors in our algebra, right? We keep things in SI units, we keep things in scientific notation. You don't want to have 8 trailing zeros at the end of your equation, right? And counting your zeros, stuff like that. You want to make sure that everything is uniform, organized, and consistent, so that you can avoid any careless errors. Sorry. Okay. Let's look at an example here. And the point of this example is that units aren't necessarily something that we just have to wrestle with the whole time, right? Units aren't our enemy. They can also be our friend. They can also help us get through problems. So let's take a look at this example. Which one of the following formulas could give the speed, velocity, in meters per second. Okay, so we're already given a velocity quantity, or the units on velocity, it's meters per second, with which sound travels through a medium whose bulk modulus, B or beta, is kilograms per meter second squared. Okay. And whose mass density, rho, is kilograms per meter cubed. Okay, so our final question here is to figure out what is the velocity v? What is the equation for velocity? And maybe if you study waves, you study how sound, you might know this equation, but the whole point is that we don't necessarily need to know everything. And that's a topic that we really hammer at the Princeton Review, because it's important for you to be able to answer questions without absolutely knowing everything. That's important, as someone in a medical profession as well, right? Okay, so let's think about this. Our final answer is meters per second. We don't need to know what bulk modulus means. We don't necessarily need to know what mass density means. But when we combine whatever combination of beta and rho together, they're going to equal something that has units meters per second. Okay. Does anyone have an idea what answer choices are not going to work? What answer choices can we eliminate? A. Yeah, I totally agree. And if you, yeah, A and C. Okay, so we're on to something. We want to eliminate the answer choices where beta is multiplied by rho. And I totally agree with that, because, well, what's going to happen? We have beta has a units of kilograms on the top, right? And rho has units of kilograms on the top as well. And so if we multiply those together, there's no way to eliminate kilograms, which we need to do because velocity doesn't have any units of kilograms. Okay, so yeah, I totally agree. I would eliminate A, I would eliminate C. The last thing I would notice is that beta has a 1 kilogram in it, rho has a 1 kilogram in it. So whatever happens, we need to eliminate those kilograms, and so we just need to divide them, right? We don't want to multiply either one. We don't want to square either one, because we just have that 1 unit left over. And so we're left over with answer choice B. Okay. So again, if there's any questions, feel free to post in the chat, and we can talk about it. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to clear this out. But odd. Okay, let's keep going. Alrighty. So we talked about some of the prerequisite concepts, some of those beginning ideas that we're going to use. Yeah. Let's take a look. So someone asks in the chat why the answer is not D. Let's look at why. So we have this formula right here. Let's write out the units for this. Beta, or B, has units of kilograms per meters second squared. Okay, and rho is kilogram meter cubed. Looking at this answer choice, well, first let's figure out what is rho squared, right? We have kilograms squared per meters. We're not necessarily going to take the time to talk about exponent rules, but this is the unit here for rho squared, right? You square each quantity and you're left over with this. If we put this into that formula, right? Let's start by just looking at beta over rho squared. We get kg meters per second squared over kg squared per meters to the 6. We got a compound fraction, so So we reverse that. We have kg squared on the bottom, meters to the 6 on the top. We can eliminate one factor of kg, right? We can eliminate one factor of kg and we're left over with m to the 6 over m second squared. And we can simplify this further. Oh, but we're still left over with a kilograms on the bottom. You're not going to eliminate that. You put a square root over it, right? That's not going to get rid of the kilogram. We go up here and we look at our value for our units on velocity. There's no kilograms in there, right? And so this is not going to work. We cannot have a kilogram left over. So D is no good. Hopefully that explains things. So let's go ahead and keep talking. Okay, so let's talk about kinematics. So a friend of yours wants to meet you in 20 minutes at a local movie theater. What do we need to know if this is possible? Okay, what do we need to know? Distance. Okay, we've got a good answer already. So let me write that down. We need to know distance. What else do we need to know? Speed you're traveling. Exactly, and I would say both of these would be for both people, right? Obstacles, yeah, well, maybe another way to think about that is how long is it going to take, right? Or how much time do you have? How much time do you have, right? When's the movie? Right, these are the three things we need to know: distance, speed, and time. Okay. Alrighty, so that's, that's a good introduction to three concepts that we're going to start discussing right now. Okay, so this whole umbrella is called kinematics. That's the study of motion. And there are three central concepts to kinematics. The first is displacement. Displacement is a physics concept that is important in a lot of different contexts. However, I'm sure that you've heard of a more common term, distance, okay? Distance is just the length of a path, right? If I go on a walk with my dog and, we go around the block and we leave from the house, we go around the block, we come back to the house. The distance traveled might be like, a mile or something, okay? That quantity, we call it a scalar because it's just a number. There's no direction associated with it. So it's a scalar quantity. And we symbolize that with D, just a unbolded regular letter D, and it has the units of meters. Okay, right. So if, we could talk about distance. If I take some path and I go like this, right, we could say this is 1 mile of distance. However, if I took that path, I would have a total displacement, and it's actually going to be a different quantity, right? So displacement is your overall change in position. So this line here, this dotted line, this is your displacement. Okay, and it is not dependent on the path you take. So for the example of my dog, I wouldn't have any displacement because I started in my house and I end in my house. Displacement is also a vector quantity. Vectors are very important. If you haven't taken the time to understand what a vector is in your previous courses, or it's something that you maybe glossed over, it's actually very important for the Mcat. We use it a lot on the physics section. So that's something I would take the time to learn. We symbolize a vector. In writing, we symbolize it with a bolded letter, right? So D bold means that this is a vector. If I were drawing, I would probably say this, something like that. You can also see something like that. There's a lot of different symbols, but usually it's either bold or there's a line. It could also be denoted as this change in displacement delta S, okay? However, the units are still meters, right? Still a meter because it's still just a length kind of, okay? All right, so let's take a look at a mini example. And I've kind of already touched on this. What's the distance traveled and displacement of the runner in 1 lap? So they run 1 lap. What's the displacement? Let's start there. Can anyone tell me what the displacement is during 1 single lap? 0, 0, 0. Got a lot of zeros and you're totally correct, right? That's where the change in position comes in. If I start here, this is my start, this is my end, right? They're the same place. The change in position is 0. So I would say D is equal to 0 meters. What about displacement? What's my what's my distance? What is my distance? Regular D. Well, yeah. We need a little formula here. We remember our circumference formula, 2 pi r. We're given r is 100 meters. And so our total distance is 1 circumference, which is equal to 2 pi times 100 meters. Perfect. Alrighty, so that's the first concept. Let's look at something a little more complicated. All right, so the next concept is velocity. Velocity, again, is the physics term. You're likely used to speed. Speed is what your car's speedometer reads, right? It's how fast something is going. Average speed, which is usually a concept that we deal with more frequently, average speed over like a period of time, right? It's just a distance over the time it took for you to travel that distance. You drive to Los Angeles, takes you 6 hours, right? You've traveled 300 miles. So you can calculate your average speed by taking how many miles you traveled and dividing it by the time it took you to do it. That's speed. Scalar quantity, again, meaning that there's no direction associated with it. It's a single quantity. And it has a symbol of V, right? Unbolded V. Usually it's kind of like a curvy sort of V. And it has units of meters per second. Velocity is the physics, corresponding physics term. And this is not only the speed that you've traveled, but the direction that you've done it in, okay? And it's, again, usually symbolized, or usually you're talking about your average velocity, where this bar here, this bar indicates that it's an average. And for that, you write your total displacement over the time it took you to do it, okay? That's average velocity. I do want to touch on a concept called instantaneous velocity, which is your velocity at a given moment. And this is a little bit more complicated, but we can look at it when we talk about the example. There is a difference there. There's 2 types of velocity, right? We have bold V as the symbol, and again, units of meters per second. Let's take a look at this example. We have the same track that this runner is running on, and we have a time that they took to do it. So it took 2 minutes. So what's the average speed and what is the average velocity? Okay. Let's start with average velocity. What are we thinking? Oh, sorry. What is the average velocity? So that's my average velocity symbol. Well, we know that it's symbolized, or we know that its formula is delta S over delta T, and this is our displacement vector, right? That's displacement, and we already calculated displacement, right? For the same runner, we know that delta S is equal to 0. Therefore, your average velocity is going to be equal to 0, right? Again, that's because we haven't moved anywhere at the end of it. Speed, a little bit trickier. I mean, we found this before. So V average speed is equal to our displacement, which in this case we found as 2 pi times 100 over 2 minutes. Remember SI units, I would convert that to seconds. And so we're left over with this quantity, right? And we could figure that out. Just quickly to touch on instantaneous velocity. Our instantaneous velocity, let's say we chose this point on the circle. Instantaneously, our velocity is actually going to be this value. It's going to have this value of speed, and it's going to have some certain direction based off of where we are. Okay, right? Because you are moving. Obviously, there is a velocity along that path. Your average velocity is 0, but your instantaneous velocity may not necessarily be 0. Okay. Alrighty. Last one here, last concept. We've talked about change in displacement. Now what happens when we're talking about change in velocity? Well, that concept is acceleration. There's no scalar equivalent to this. It's always a vector. Acceleration is defined as how fast velocity is changing. Your average acceleration over a period of time would be symbolized, would be the equation delta V over delta T, right? The total change in your velocity over time. Okay. Vector quantity, again, symbolized by A, or A with a little arrow. Units are meters per second squared. And you think about, how do we get there? How do we get to meters per second squared? Well, look at our formula. We know that V has meters per second. Delta T has units of second. So you divide V over T, and you get meters per second squared. Okay. If the runner runs at a constant speed, what is the magnitude of the average acceleration? Here's another good one. So we're talking about a period of time. Just like with velocity, there's instantaneous acceleration, but again, we're talking about average acceleration in this problem. And so to solve for this, we would notice that if this person is running in a circle, yeah, their velocity vector is going to be, their instantaneous velocity vector is going to be rotating as they travel around. This is V, 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 right? But their initial velocity vector, V0, and their final velocity vector, V, are the exact same thing, right? Assuming they don't speed up, they don't slow down, they're the same thing. And so we can say that our delta V is equal to 0. Doesn't matter what our time is, our average acceleration is going to be equal to 0. Okay. Question, is instantaneous acceleration equal to 0? No. Our velocity vector is rotating around. And since velocity is both defined as magnitude and direction, if the direction is changing, there must be some instantaneous acceleration. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so that's kind of it for the main concepts of acceleration, or of kinematics. We've learned about how to describe a change in position, how to describe a changing, you know, a changing position vector and a changing velocity vector. And so we have these three main concepts, and they really tie everything together. And obviously there are a few more concepts related to this, but these are the basic ones that are most important. Let's talk a little bit more about vectors and how to describe them, how to use them and manipulate them. Vectors are extremely important. Once again, we don't want to forget how to use these. Let's take a look at this problem. the velocity of an object changes from v0 to v in 1 second. Which of the following best describes the object's average acceleration? Okay. So the answer is already up on screen here, but if we have a initial velocity vector that it goes upward, and we have a final velocity vector that goes toward the right, what we know is that acceleration is described as the change in velocity, which is v final minus v initial. Time is just one, and it's a scalar, so it just kind of goes away. We don't need to think about it too much. And so our acceleration vector is going to be described by this expression v minus v0. So how do we draw that? How do we draw that? Well, the first thing that we need is our velocity vector. Our final velocity vector is the first part of this expression. Now, we need to add to that the negative v initial. In order to do that, we turn our positive v0 into a negative v0. And to do that, we just kind of flip it around, right? Where the tail was before we put the end, and where the end is, we put the tail, right? That's how you negate something geometrically. That's how you negate a vector. And then we add that by putting the tip of this vector that we're adding to the tail of the second vector, right? And so we get the resultant vector, which travels from the tip of the original one to the end of the final one, okay? And so our answer here is C, right? And we're going to talk about vectors a little bit more on the next slide. These are really important. They come up a lot. Any questions up until now? Yeah, I see Sori has her hand raised. Yeah, so they ask, how is it that the V0 is where we end up? And I kind of understand what you're asking here. So, well, when we're adding two vectors, let's say we have some, you know, it doesn't have to be a velocity vector. It could be any sort of vector. Let's say we have a V total, which is equal to V1 plus V2, right? We have any two vectors, and V1 could be the vector that looks like this. V2 could be the vector that looks like this. If we want to figure out what the total, the sum of these two vectors, we're going to just attach the beginning point of the second vector to the end of the first, and the result is the vector that travels from the beginning of the first vector to the end of the second one. Remember that in the equation that we're using to describe acceleration, velocity, the v0 vector is actually negated, right? They told us in our problem what the positive value of v0 is. They did not tell us what the negative value of v0 is. And so in order to figure out what the value of this expression v minus v0 is, we need to turn that positive vector into a negative one. And to do that, we flip it, right? We put the tail where the tip is and vice versa. Does that help? Great, great. Well, and everyone has a little bit of a different way to do this. So whatever works for you, that's great. All right, let's keep going. Here's another discussion of vectors, and this ties in with what we were talking about with kinematics. When we're driving in our car, we have a few colloquial words that we use to talk about certain actions that we take. Typically, when I say I'm accelerating, right, that means that I am stepping on the gas pedal, right? I'm moving the car faster forward. I'm speeding up. So that's our common form of acceleration, but that's not the only way that we can accelerate in a physics classroom, right? We can also step on the brake. You might call that deceleration, but they're both accelerations, right? It's just a acceleration in a negative sense, right? Where your acceleration vector is pointing in the opposite direction as your velocity. That's what I would call slowing down. But that, again, is not the only way to accelerate. There's a third way, and this one may be the most unusual. If you turn your steering wheel, you're actually also accelerating. And if you are just turning your steering wheel and you're not changing how fast you're driving or putting on the brake or putting on the gas, then your acceleration vector is going to be at a right angle to your velocity vector. And the result is that your new velocity is going to turn. This is our delta V, and our new velocity is going to be the same length, the same magnitude, but in a different direction. Okay, and that's the third way to accelerate in a car. And again, this all ties in with our notion of vectors and how to describe them. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so let's go ahead and keep moving here. Continuing to talk about these three quantities, there are a lot of graphs on the Mcat, right? There are a lot of charts, especially in the physics section. You're going to see a couple charts, and it's important to understand how to get important quantities out of those charts. It's not all just about, you know, what's the velocity at 2 seconds, right? It can go deeper than that. So there are three actually different things that we can figure out, not just on a kinematic graph, but on a graph of almost anything in the physics section. The first one I talked about, and that one I'm sure you're familiar with, you know, the value at a point. What is velocity at 3 seconds, right? Well, we draw a line up from 3, we find that out, and we see that it's, you know, 3 comma 4, so the velocity at that moment is 4 meters per second, right? We can figure that one out. That's value at a point. There are other two really important quantities, and a lot of times they're not going to ask you, you know, what's the slope of the line between 0 and 1. They're never going to ask you that. Instead, they're going to ask you, you know, a trickier quantity. And again, this is applicable to all different types of graphs, not just kinematic graphs. Okay. And typically the best way to think about this is to look at the units. Okay, so let's talk about slope. It's a little cluttered here, so it might get a little cluttered, my bad, but if we have a slope quantity, so I'm just going to write in this section. Slope we know as rise over run, or delta y over delta x. Okay, that's the slope of a line. Now, in this case, well, y is velocity, right? And x is time. So if we write a delta y over delta x, what sort of units would slope have? Well, if y is velocity, then the top would be meters per second, and x is time, so the bottom is seconds. And so we see that slope for this graph is going to be meters per second squared. Hopefully we remember what that is, right? What sort of unit is that? Well, that's an acceleration, right? So in this chart with a velocity versus time graph, slope represents acceleration. And that's super useful, right? Here's a couple examples that you might be asked. What is the average acceleration from 0 to 1 second, right? Well, in order to do that, find the slope. Find the slope. Well, let's calculate our rise over run. We've got 2 points. We've got 0, 0. We've got 1, 4. And so our rise is just going to be our change in y over change in x. We start at 0, so it's just 4 over 1 equals 4 meters per second squared. Right? That is our average acceleration. And we can figure out for these other quantities, you know, just looking at the graph, what is the acceleration between 1 second and 4 seconds? Well, what's the slope, right? No slope. That's actually 0 slope. 0 slope, right? So there's no acceleration, 0 acceleration. But that's not it. We have another quantity, area under the curve, and that can also be useful. If we just look at a little section here, let's say we just look at this area between 3 and 4 seconds. This area quantity, it's some base times height. This height is some velocity, it's 4 meters per second. This base is 1 second, right? 1 second down below. And so our area is going to be meters per second times seconds. And so the result is actually 4 meters. The area quantity here has a units of meters. And so area under the curve is going to represent a displacement. That represents displacement. And that's, you know, that's kind of a higher level concept. We could talk about that more. It gets into calculus, right? You may remember this from calculus class, yeah. Anyway, the point I'm making here is that if you look at the units on these 3 quantities, value at a point, slope, and area, you may learn something. You might be able to answer a question that you may not otherwise have been able to. And this is applicable to pressure versus volume charts. This is applicable to so many different things. Always check out those units. Like I said, units can a lot of times be our friend. Okay. Okay, so that's it for our little kinematics section. We still have plenty of time. Here's a good question, and it comes up a lot in kinematics. So in what way can a question stem, a question, imply values of kinematic variables without stating them? Okay. You know, they're not always just going to give you some numbers and ask you to do some math. It might be a more conceptual sort of question. You know, I'm thinking, classic example you've heard in physics. Well, if I drop an object off a building, right? If I drop an object off a building, that's a common setup for a problem. What are they saying if I say I drop an object? You know, what sort of kinematic quantities might we be able to infer from that statement, drop an object? Right? We have velocity, we have acceleration, we have position. Well, dropping, they didn't say throw, right? They didn't say throw an object. So we could assume that our initial velocity would be 0, right? Drop means you didn't throw it, right? So, and they do tricky stuff like that all the time. So they say an object, you know, began from rest, began from rest, or maybe thrown horizontally, right? This has to do with vectors, right? This means that there is no vertical velocity, right? No velocity in the vertical direction, just a horizontal velocity, right? Okay. So that's just kind of a reflection on kinematics, and you know, not every problem is going to be straightforward and explained well. You may have to infer some quantities. Okay. All right. So we still have time. So we're going to get into another layer of kinematics. I would start to call this dynamics, and this is Newton's laws. And you know, you've heard of Newton. Hopefully, you remember some of what he was talking about. So let's think about this. Let's think about this question. If I throw a ball into the air, at what time or when does the force of your throw of your hand stop acting on the ball? Okay. When does your throw stop acting on the ball, the force of your throw? Anyone have an idea? There are a lot of different answers that people give. Clues. Well, you know, if I'm throwing it, so we've got an answer here when the force of gravity outweighs it when it stops. Okay, these are very common answers, and unfortunately, I don't agree with either of them. Lillian here, when it leaves your hand. Yes, that is correct. When it leaves your hand. This is one of the most key things that Newton described. People didn't know this before. People did not understand this concept before Newton. We used to think that that it wasn't this way. We thought that, you know, for example, if you throw an object, well, eventually it falls to the ground and it stops. And so you know, we used to think that all things did that. That's just how things work, that eventually everything sort of comes to rest, but that's not necessarily the case. The force of your throw can only be present when you're touching that ball. That's because whatever forces you're using to throw it are called contact forces. And so they can only happen when there's contact between the two objects. You know, there are a few forces that aren't like that. We'll talk about them. Okay, so this ties into Newton's first law, the law of inertia. And what it says is that velocity tends to remain constant if there are no external forces. And, you know, this is said in two different ways. An object at motion tends to stay in motion. An object at rest tends to stay at rest. And again, this is actually opposite to our intuitive understanding of how the world works, right? If you throw a ball, you think that you know it's going to fall, eventually it's going to stop, right? But that's because there is a force doing that. There can be no change in velocity without a force, a applied net force, right? Where net means like the sum of all forces, right? The sum of all forces. Okay, mass. So mass is a measure of resistance to acceleration, right? It is harder to push something that is more massive. And your push will do less to that object if it's more massive. In physics, we always measure mass with kilograms, no pounds, no, you know, it's kilograms always. And it is a scalar quantity. It never has direction. Mass doesn't have direction. Let's talk about that concept of net force just a little bit. This again ties in with vectors and how to add them, how to subtract them. Like I said, net force is the sum of individual forces, right? If we have 3 different forces acting on an object, we could talk about the net force We could talk about the net force as the addition of those three, but it's a vector addition, right? Remember, when we're adding, you know, this velocity to that velocity, all right, the sum is the total length of the two added together. Well, that's true here with forces as well. So here's a couple examples. If we have two forces in the same direction, right, you and your friend are both pulling the block, well, you're going to have an added net force that is larger than the individual of either of you. Right? If you and your friend are playing tug of war, right, that's the second example. You're tugging against each other. Well, the total net force on this object, what this blue object feels, is a force that's weaker than either of you, right? Force that is a subtraction of these two. And then we have our final case, and that's where two forces are pulling in opposite directions, or not opposite directions, but directions that are perpendicular to each other. And in that case, the net force is going to be going in this diagonal direction, right, up and to the right, because that is the sum of the two vectors. Okay. Yeah, so that's just a review of what a net force is. It's very important, and it ties in with how we calculate the kinematic quantities related to this. Okay, so let's get into that. We're getting here into Newton's second law, and this is the formula that you've heard before. And that says that F equals ma. Really specifically, F net equals ma, and these two things are vectors, right? The units on force is a Newton. That's a derived force made of kilograms times meters per second, right? And we get that from the formula. Mass has units of kilograms, acceleration has units of meters per second, and the result is this thing, which we call a Newton. Right? Fun fact, one Newton is like supposed to be like the weight of a common apple, okay? Because the whole Newton dropping apple on his head thing. Anyway, so an applied net force causes a acceleration which changes the velocity of the object. What we know is that mass is always positive, right? Mass can never be negative in this world. There's no negative mass, and so F and A are always going to be in the same direction, and that you intuitively understand. You pull something towards you, it's always going to move towards you. It's never going to move away. And we could write that with a proportionality statement. F is proportional to acceleration, right? Just a common proportionality. If F net is 0, then A equals 0, right? And this is the first law, right? Object in motion stays in motion. Object at rest stays at rest. So you don't really need to think about that second law or that first law if you have the second one. Another important concept is that these components, meaning the acceleration in the x direction, the acceleration in the y direction, can be broken up and dealt with separately. You know, that's a practical thing we're not going to get into today. Okay, this is pretty much our last example here for today. So what are the forces required to accelerate a 50 kilogram person up at a rate of 2 meters per second in a 1,000 kilogram elevator suspended by a cable? You know, just kind of thinking about these things, we have F equals ma. We know that m of the elevator is 1,000. M of the person equals 50. We want an acceleration of 2. But we also need to think about what forces are present. There are a few forces that we're going to deal with on the MCAT. The first is tension. This is the force of a rope or a string or anything like that, anything that's pulling at a distance. And you know that a rope, if you push on a rope, you can't push something. And so we always know that the tension force points along the rope and away from the object, and it can't be pushed back. It can only pull. Another important thing is that it's always same throughout that rope. Normal force is a really unique and strange force. It's the force exerted by a surface in order to keep itself intact. What that means is that if I'm sitting on a chair, that chair doesn't have to hold me up, right? I could just fall through the ground. But the normal force is responsible, because that chair isn't just going to disintegrate when I sit on it. That normal force, it's really like electricity. It's really like the interaction between molecules. That's going to keep me up. And we call that the normal force. There's no like equation for it. It responds to what forces are being applied toward it, right? If you get up from the chair, there's not a normal force sitting, waiting for you to sit back down, right? It only responds to you as a reaction. And we have weight. Weight is also very unusual because it's called at a distance. It doesn't need to be in contact, right? Gravitational forces don't need to be in contact. This isn't an astronomy class, but we typically use this equation: weight equals mg, right? On Earth, mass times gravity. G, which is one of those quantities you need to know. It's a quantity that you have to have memorized going in. Okay, let's look at this a little bit more closely. Typically, I would draw a free body diagram. Notice this diagram drawn here. This is a diagram of the system, meaning that I didn't include any of the internal forces, really the normal forces that are keeping this person off the ground, right? Or keeping this person, standing up straight. I don't include those because it's not really relevant to this problem, right? What are the forces required? Well, there's only this tension force in the cable. And that all it has to really resist is the total weight of this object, where, remember, we have our formula for weight. It's equal to mg, which is m person plus m elevator, times g, which is a 1050 times 9.81. That's our weight, and it's pointing down, right? Our tension force is pointing up. We don't know the value of it. We're trying to figure that out. So we could write our F net. Typically, I would designate some sort of coordinate system, right? If y is going up, that means any forces that go up are positive, any forces that go down are negative. So that would mean that our F net equation is T minus weight, which we've calculated previously. We know that F equals m times A. We know A is 2, and so we can write out our equation that describes tension. Tension equals m times A. Oh, sorry. Tension equals m times A plus weight. So we have 1050 times 2 plus 1050 times 9.8. And that is the value of tension. You could go ahead and calculate that out. But that's the answer to this one. And yeah, so that's a basic problem. we worked through what all the forces that are present. We drew a free body diagram, and then we set up Newton's second law and found how the net force is related to acceleration. Okay, pretty typical problem, pretty useful. Okay, all right, so we actually have one more Newton's law, and that's Newton's third law. We would have to multiply that by hand. Simon asks, we have to multiply by hand? Yes, you do. So for this problem, you know, we got 1050 times 9.8, make that 9.810, right? You're only going to have A, B, C, D, right? And they're not going to have an A that's that close to a B. So on the MCAT, you're going to have to simplify things, ballpark, right? Figure out how to get to an answer choice without doing absolutely every step of the work, right? But yeah, you would have to do that by hand. Yeah, you haven't done it in a while. That's why you need to practice. It's hard. It's not easy. I can't do it, right? You know, when I get out of practice teaching, it becomes difficult for me to like. That's why I'm not doing it right now. I haven't taught in a while. It's hard to do, especially when you're under pressure, right, during a test. It's difficult. Okay. So yeah, Newton's third law. This is a conceptual topic, and for what it says is that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So action in this wording means force. So for every force there's an equal and opposite reaction force. The force is the same. That doesn't mean acceleration is the same, right? Because each object that's in this relationship may have a different mass. So we can't say that the accelerations are the same, only the forces. And forces in this pair, they're equal in magnitude, but they're opposite in the direction, right? If you push on a block, what you're feeling is that block is pushing back on you. That's why it's hard to move it, right? And action-reaction pairs, don't get confused with two different forces that are equal in magnitude. Just because they're equal in magnitude doesn't necessarily mean that they're action-reaction pairs. They have to be a result of the same process, the same, you know, whether it's gravity, whether it's normal force or something like that. Looking at this a little bit more deeply, right? If a person is standing on the ground, you may think that the reaction to that gravitational force on their body is the normal force that the ground is pushing up on them, but that's actually not true. The reaction force to gravity pulling down on that person is actually the force that you pull up on the earth with, because you have mass, so you exert gravity. It's tiny, right? It's minuscule, but it does exist, and that's the reaction force for that. The reaction pair for normal force over here is actually the normal force that you push down on the earth with, right? If you step on a squishy surface, not only does that surface hold you up, but you push down on it a little bit, right? And so that's the pair there. This is a very commonly mistaken situation. Just remember that they have to be a result of the same process. They have to be, you know, if your force is from gravity, the reaction force also has to be gravity. It can't be another type of force like normal. Okay, so we're nearing the end here. Just a quick summary of these Newton's laws, right? We have our first law, object in motion stays in motion, object at rest stays in rest. We have our second law, which is our F equals ma. It's our computational law that we use to actually do math and actually solve problems. And then we have a third law, which is your conceptual one, and that's your action-reaction pair, your equal and opposite forces. You got to know these. You have to know how to use them and where they're applicable. Okay. Alrighty. So just our final reflection here. When does a force stop acting on an object? Well, we answered this one, right? It depends. For contact forces, like tension, normal, friction, didn't talk about friction, but that is when they're not in contact. Right? Gravitational force never goes away. You never lose gravity. It's always present. And then how do we know when to use Newton's second law or Newton's third law? Well, typically Newton's second law deals with a single object with multiple forces, a net force. Newton's third law deals with two objects with a single force between them, right? So yeah, second law, that's one object with multiple forces. Third law, two objects with one force. Right? That's kind of the rule of thumb. That's a good way to figure it out. Okay, so we're low on time. I have a typical passage here. We're not going to do it. I mean, I guess we do have a good amount of. We probably could. So let's go ahead and take 4 minutes, not very long, 3 minutes. Read through this if you can. Hopefully it's big enough on your screen.
I would actually say we have until noon, so we only have about 6 minutes left overall.
Great.
So I don't know if you'd be able to get through even a question doing that. So
sounds good.
Why don't we open it up for questions and see what we've got out there? So
alrighty.
Any kind of questions you guys have for Rain?
Yeah. So it looks like we've got a question.
Like
Can we over the logistics, type of number question, how it works, since the same section is chemistry? Yeah. So I wish I had like more slides to write on here. So the physics section is in Chem and Phys. You're correct about that. There is 25% of this section that is physics. Okay, so you do your math there. 25% of a quarter of the test, right? So a quarter of a quarter, not very much. We do teach a lot of it at the Princeton Review because of the importance that it has, not only for the test, but sort of the thinking that goes behind it. So the way that it's kind of bundled in to the passages is you have a few freestanding questions, 15 freestanding questions, and then you have like I think it's 4 to 6 passages with around 10 questions each. So, or sorry, yeah, anyway, there's 59 questions, 15 are freestanding, the rest are through passages. And those passages typically are focused on physics or chemistry. And the passage itself is going to be on a concept. We saw this one, it's about pool therapy. There's a lot of discussion about kinematics, about dynamics and forces, right? And this passage may have up to it's usually like 4 to 6 questions, right? And yeah, that passage is going to be focused on physics. You'll have a few freestanding questions that are focused on physics, but then the rest of the passage is going to be talking about chemistry. There will be a couple chemistry passages. You may have passages that are sort of mixture of the two. And that's generally how it goes. Yeah. Like I said, 25% of 25%, not a ton of work, but it does, the ideas behind physics will help you with the rest of the test and with the rest of the Chem Phys section. So And yeah, just to summarize, about 59 questions, 15 freestanding questions, and the rest are associated with a passage. Yep. Any other questions here? Alrighty. Well, thank you all. So again, I teach for the Princeton Review. So if you take a course at the Princeton Review, especially if it's through Davis somehow, probably have me as your physics teacher. I study here at Davis. I'm a grad student. So if you have questions about how to you know, apply to grad school, if that's also something you're considering, or you have questions about what a master's looks like at Davis, those are also questions I can answer. Or if you just got a physics interesting question you want to ask, feel free to email me. Again, my emails through Davis are mmilner@Davis. All right.
Alrighty,
Well,
well,
thank
thank
you
you, Rain. Thank you, Rain, for stopping in and teaching us a little bit about forces and kinematics. So for the Mcat, I appreciate it, and thank you all for sticking out with us for another Saturday morning. Bright and shiny when we come back from break. We'll be back on the the second Saturday of January. I believe that is January 9th at 9 a.m. and we will be covering personal statements and another section of the Mcat. So thank you guys for coming today. Appreciate it. Like I said, the recording will show up in many various places. So keep your eye out for the link. So if there's any final thoughts, questions, whatever, just let me know. And thank you all for coming.